All right, it's time for Unit 5, Lecture 3. We are going to be looking at the blood vessels. All right, so our task list for this lecture here, we're going to take some notes over it. Then there is the Unit 5 homework assignment, Module 16, so that's about the blood vessels. There is an artery flow chart and a vein flow chart with some keys. These are a great way to study for these. Just a very good way to actually see where things are running. So I would use those if you can. There is another one on there which is more, there's more details to them. You don't have to do those, just some people like to use them. So if you'd like to use them as well, you can. Please start or continue studying for the Unit 5 exam and practical. If you have any questions about the study materials, don't hesitate to contact me. And then, of course, there is the Unit 5 Quiz 3. So before we actually get to the blood vessels, we want to make sure that we know that there are different circuits of blood flow, so how blood flows through the body. As a reminder, blood isn't just free in the body, it's in blood vessels, all right? So blood has to be in a blood vessel, otherwise it won't get to your tissues appropriately. So the three circuits that we have are the pulmonary circuit, the systemic circuit, and the coronary circuit. Pulmonary should remind you of your lungs, and that's exactly what the pulmonary circuit has to do with. So your pulmonary circuit is the circuit to your lungs. So you know that your heart is going to pump blood to the lungs and then back to the heart again. That is going to be the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so from the heart to the lungs and back again is going to be your pulmonary circuit. We also have the systemic circuit, which is essentially everything except for your lungs and your heart. Okay, so the systemic circuit is everything except for your lungs and that heart muscle itself. So any other tissue that we have would be systemic. And then our third circuit is going to be our coronary circuit, and coronary circuit is just to the heart muscle itself. So the coronary circuit is just to those arteries and the veins that go to and from the heart muscle itself. Okay, so not the chambers of the heart, but to the actual myocardium. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. Just a final reminder, your systemic is not going to go to the lungs, and neither does it go to the heart either. So you want to make sure that you remember these three separate circuits and where they're actually going. We're going to take a look at the different types of blood vessels, starting at the heart. We're going to start at the heart, and then we're going to come all the way back to the heart. I ask you kind of one question per slide here, so if you were scared of like the 47 slides that were on this one, don't be. It's just because I've broken this down quite a bit to make it a little bit easier flow to it here. So when you see the heart here, you see this heart right here in the middle. I made that beautiful looking star there. Blood is going to leave the heart, and it's going to leave the heart through what kind of vessel? Now that is going to be an artery. We already knew this from before. Remember how we said arteries go away, right? So arteries go away from the heart. So blood leaves the heart through an artery. We see arteries written right here. We're going to talk about a couple of main arteries today and what they are actually doing. So first, we're going to leave the heart through an artery. After going through an artery, what does blood reach? So if you follow this along, we go from the heart to an artery, and then our arteries lead to these things called arterioles. So we're going to go to an arteriole now after an artery. Arteriole basically is like a small artery. So a smaller artery, it sounds like a smaller artery, like, oh, you're such a little arteriole. Oh, how cute is that? So we go from an artery to a little arteriole. All right, so now we're going from an arterial to a next spot here. So again, starting at the heart, we go from the heart to an artery. Arteries become these cute little arterioles, and then arterioles are going to keep going and they're going to stop right here and become capillaries. So we're seeing here that we now have these things called capillaries. We'll talk about what capillaries do a little bit later in this lecture here. So from arteries to arterioles to capillaries. All right, so after a capillary, we're going to keep on moving forward here. So we know it's arteries to arterioles to capillaries, and then after capillaries, we go to venules. So a venule is essentially a tiny vein. Not as cute of a name as arterioles, because I feel like arterioles just tells you it's a tiny artery. But venules are tiny veins on their way back to the heart. Remember, arteries are going away from the heart and veins are coming back to the heart. All right, so after a venule, we are now going to enter another little area here. So after going through a venule, where are we going to be reaching to? Good. If you said vein, you are absolutely correct. So we go from an artery to an arterial, to a venule, to a vein. So we can see how we're kind of going in a circle throughout our bodies here. All right, so lastly, we have to take a look at where it goes after it goes through a vein. So as blood is traveling along, we can see that after a vein, we are going to go directly back to the heart. Okay, so after we go through a vein, we're going to go directly back into a heart. Into a heart? Into the heart. There we go, into the heart. We don't have multiple hearts, so back to the heart.
Heart eye.
Alrighty, so knowing this, hopefully this has already been like, okay, I get it. April, you've spent 8 minutes talking about this. It's not that hard. So blood goes from the heart to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to veins, and then back to the heart. Okay, so that's how blood travels throughout our body. No matter where it's going, whether it be the pulmonary circuit, whether it be the coronary circuit or the systemic circuit, blood is always going to travel in this way. So now we're going to take a look at the actual blood vessels and what we find between our arteries and our veins. Notice how I have A, B, and C labeled here off to the left. We have the possibilities for A, B, and C over to the right. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to figure out what A, B, and C are. All right, so looking at A, that's my cat, she's fine. So that's A. A is the most internal, so A is going to be the tunica interna. B is in the middle, therefore it's the tunica media. And C is the most external, the most superficial structure of the artery, and that is your tunica externa. A tunic is just a layer. Back in the day, they used to call like layers of clothing, like tunics, like you'd wear your tunic, that'd be a layer of clothing. So that's just what tunica is referring to. It's the either internal or the middle or the external layer. You know the type of question I'm going to ask you about when it comes to this. It's going to be like, name the layers of the blood vessels, found most external to most internal, or most superficial to most deep. So keep that one in mind. Arteries, when you take a look at them, they're strong and they're thick. They can hold a lot of pressure, and they're also difficult to tear. So arteries are very strong, very thick. They're also typically deeper in your skin than veins as well, which is why when you look at your body in any way, when you see your blood vessels, you see like veins. You don't see your arteries. They're just not surfacey. Next blood vessel we're going to take a look at here is the vein. Looking at A, B, and C here. A, B, and C are the same as they were on the last slide because A is the most internal. It's going to be the tunica interna. B is in the middle. Therefore, it's the tunica media, and C is the tunica externa because it is the most external layer. Now, if you look between the pictures of an artery and a vein, the arteries are much thicker and stronger than the veins are. Veins are much thinner than arteries, much easier to get into, and they have a much lower pressure than an artery does. This is why we use veins to draw blood most of the time, because they're more surfacey, they're thinner, and they're easier to get into. Also, when you draw blood from like a vein, it's not going to be at such a high pressure, which makes it a little easier to get blood. And also, once you get out, you can stop the blood flow out of the blood vessel pretty easily. So looking at the picture to the right here, we see two pictures of blood vessels. One's an artery and one is a vein. What do you think A is? Yeah, A is going to be an artery. We know that because when we look at the size of this right here, red's not showing up. Let's try yellow. When we look at the size of the actual layers, they are very, very thick and they look very, very strong. And also, there's high pressure in this. The way that we know that there's high pressure in this is it's completely open. So the blood vessel is completely open with a high blood pressure, or high pressure in general. B then is going to be a vein. So B, the cat is going crazy. It's kind of funny. Addie, stop running. Anyways, so the vein is B over here. You know that because when you look at this blue little region here, it's a lot smaller, right? It's a lot smaller, especially in comparison to that artery over there with A. And it's not inflated, which means that there's not a lot of pressure going through that vessel. And that's the main characteristic of your vein, is the fact that it doesn't have a lot of pressure, and it's also going to have a thinner wall to it. Looking over here to the bottom left, we have an artery and a vein, and I've circled something that veins have that arteries don't. What do veins have that arteries don't? Yeah, they have valves. So veins have valves for the same reason it's because of their characteristics. They need valves because, first of all, they're trying to get blood back to the heart. So if we're trying to get blood back to the heart, you have to fight against those resistances, especially think of like your feet, right? Trying to get blood all the way back from your feet to your heart. It's going to take a little bit of strength. They need a little bit of help. So valves are there to basically get blood back to the heart. Since there's not a lot of pressure in your veins, blood can settle. So we need those valves so when blood settles, it doesn't just pool in your body. It can actually just stop at the valve and then get pushed up a little further. Veins are helped by movement to get your blood back to your heart, which is why if you walk or something like that, the blood is going to get back to your heart faster than if you aren't walking or if you're not moving around. I like to explain the difference between arteries and veins with like a spigot. Like what that means is if you've ever tried to wash off the dissection tray with a what are they called? The sinks that have the actual spigots, the skinny spigots on them. You turn that on, it just sprays everywhere. High pressure, it's just bad, right? And then your other instance is when you have the spigot with a tube that's attached to it. Much less pressure and much easier to control. So that's the main difference between things like your arteries and your veins. Take a look at varicose veins here. We have a figure of normal veins and then a figure of varicose veins. So what is happening in varicose veins? What is causing them? So when you look at what's going on here, the valves aren't working properly with varicose veins. Over here with the normal veins, if you look on the bottom, notice how you have these valves and they're shut. They're doing their job appropriately. Over here with the varicose veins, the valves aren't doing their job correctly, especially this one down here. Notice how the valve isn't shutting appropriately. So that's going to cause some problems with blood flow. Is blood flowing the way that it should with varicose veins? No, what it's doing is it's pooling. So it's kind of sitting in the veins rather than moving forward. You can have surgery to fix varicose veins, but one thing that you can do to kind of help with these is good old compression stockings. So compression stockings are going to help the veins get the blood back to the heart because that pressure allows for the blood to move up and back towards the heart. A little bit easier than getting surgery done. We're going to take a look at capillaries now. Remember we talked about that in between your arterial and your venule, we have a capillary. We have a little picture up here to the right that's showing you how many red blood cells can go through a capillary. So how many red blood cells can go through a capillary at one time? Yeah, we have one. So they're about the thickness of one red blood cell. Red blood cells are tiny, so capillaries are tiny. They're very, very small. We have two figures here. We have A and B. Which figure is a continuous capillary? Yep. A is a continuous capillary. And which one is a fenestrated capillary then? Yeah, that's going to be B. So fenestrated means porous. Okay, so porous. Fenestrated means porous. You can think of being frustrated because you have big pores or something like that on your face. So we have fenestrated capillaries. They're porous capillaries. We're going to talk about what this means in just a second. So capillaries function to allow materials to pass from blood vessels to the tissues and vice versa. So they're there to get the oxygen and the carbon dioxide and the waste and the nutrients to where they need to be. There are some different materials that can pass from blood vessels to tissues. One of those is oxygen. Oxygen is the big one. We also have carbon dioxide that we want to do that with. Sugars can go through along with waste materials. There's other things that can pass from blood vessels to tissues and vice versa. We're just not going to mention all of them because there's just too many. So we're going to stick with these four. So we know that we have this A and B. A is going to be that continuous capillary. B is going to be that fenestrated capillary. Which one of those capillaries is going to be more permeable or allow more things to come in and out of it? And that's going to be your fenestrated capillary because there's pores in it. It'll be way more, it's easier to get things in and out of something that has holes in it than something that doesn't. Okay, which one would be less permeable then? And it's going to be our continuous capillary. Continuous capillary doesn't have pores in it, therefore it's going to be less permeable than that fenestrated one. Continuous capillary is the most common. We find it in skin and in muscles. And a fenestrated capillary is found in areas where absorption is important, such as your intestine and your kidneys. All right, before we dive right into all the systemic arteries, we're going to first do just a little bit of review here. So where does the left ventricle first pump its blood? So if you remember from the heart, your left ventricle is going to go through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta, right? So the aorta is going to be where we first pump blood. Blood actually goes through the aorta, and there's three different parts to the aorta that we're talking about. So there's the ascending aorta, the descending aorta, and the aortic arch. So if you look over there to the right, you can see those three structures of the aorta. So why do you think the ascending and the descending aortas are named the way they are? Yeah, because one goes up and the other goes down. So the ascending aorta is going up and the descending aorta is going down. So first we're going to follow letter A's path here. So we can see letter A here on this picture of this man here. I think he looks like Topher Grace. That's what I thought last time too. So a little Topher Grace over here. He's got letter A that we're going to take a look at. What is letter A? Yeah, that's an ascending aorta. That's a part of the aorta that is going upwards. When we look over here at the picture to the left, we see the ascending aorta right here is our ascending aorta. What is our ascending aorta connected to? Yeah, it's connected to the coronary arteries. You can see them labeled here. The coronary arteries is what the ascending aorta is connected to. So we go from our ascending aorta to the coronary arteries. Do you remember what our coronary arteries are doing? Yeah, they're supplying the heart muscle itself with blood. So that's where we're at right now. Ascending aorta leads to those coronary arteries, which supply the heart muscle with blood. So there is a flow chart called the artery flow chart that is on Moodle. So if you would go ahead and download it and you can start filling this in. It's nice to like print it out and maybe put a transparency sheet over the top of it and fill it in. That way you can kind of practice with it. But this is going to follow that flow chart. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is going to be the ascending aorta. And the ascending aorta is going to flow its blood into the coronary arteries. I'm going to take a look now at our aortic arch and how it's branching. So notice that at your aortic arch at the top here, you can see that there are actually three branches that our aortic branch is going to, or our aortic arch is going to branch into. Now the right branch we can see is over here. This is going to be our right branch, this one that I have in yellow. What artery is the right branch? It's the brachiocephalic artery. So the brachiocephalic artery comes off the right branch of our aortic arch. Based off its name, it's called brachio and cephalic. So hopefully that is something, again, we're pulling from Unit 1, right? We have to know these words. If we know these words' meanings, then we know what we're looking at here. What parts of the body would this artery affect? Yeah, brachio, we're talking about the arm region. And cephalic, we're talking about the head region. So it's going to be affecting our arms and our head. Now we're going to take a look at the branches of the brachiocephalic artery. We actually have three branches to it. We have the right common carotid artery, the right subclavian artery, and the vertebral artery. Anytime you see that A period, it means artery. So just keep that in mind. We have A, B, and C on the picture to the right. They correspond with those choices to the left. So what do you think A is? A is going to be our right common carotid artery. We can see that it's going up the neck region, which is often when you think of your carotid artery, you probably think of your neck. That's usually what people talk about there. What do you think B is? Yep, it's going up through the vertebrae, so that's going to be the vertebral artery, right? So since it's going up through the vertebrae, it's going to be vertebral, which leaves C as the right subclavian. If you look at where the right subclavian artery is, it's underneath the clavicle. So subclavian literally means underneath our clavicle. So that is how that artery is going to run. Which artery of these three would go towards the arm? Now that's going to be our right subclavian. It makes sense. It's running underneath the clavicle. The clavicle actually attaches, remember, to the scapula, and that's near your arm. And which artery would run up the spine? Yeah, that's going to be the vertebral. Vertebral and spine are pretty synonymous in their names. So now we're looking at the right subclavian only. So the right subclavian now branches into further arteries. Hopefully when you look at all of these names, you're like, I know these make sense. Again, this is an instance of don't memorize something you already know. Okay, so when you look at these, hopefully that makes sense. We have A, B, C, and D. When you look at A, what artery do you believe it to be? Yeah, A is going to be the axillary artery because it's in the armpit region, and axillary means armpit. What about B? It's going to be brachial. The brachial artery is running along the upper arm, which again makes sense. That's what brachial means. What about C? That's going to be our radial artery because it's on the side of the radius, which leaves D to be the ulnar artery because it's on the side of the ulna. All of these four arteries are going to branch off of one. What artery do all of the above branches branch off of? Yeah, the right subclavian. Right, there are three branches of our brachiocephalic artery. We've talked about what those are. What are those three? Yeah, we have those three that are bracketed there. We have the right subclavian, the vertebral, and the right common carotid. What is our right common carotid artery branching into? Yeah, we can see it here. It branches into an internal and an external common carotid. So external and internal common carotid is what our common carotid branches into. Which common carotid artery would be most superficial? That'd be our external common carotid. Makes sense because external sounds like it would be more superficial than an internal. An internal one would be much, much deeper. All right, so we have our flow chart. We're going to start at our aortic arch. We are only looking at one branch off the aortic arch right now. So on that right side of your aortic arch, you're going to have the brachiocephalic artery coming off. The brachiocephalic artery is going to branch into the right subclavian. And your right subclavian is going to branch into the axillary, then to the brachial, then to your radial and ulnar arteries. Your brachiocephalic also is going to branch into your right common carotid artery. which then branches into your internal and your external common carotid. And the last place that we've looked at that your brachiocephalic artery will branch into is the vertebral artery. All right, so we've taken care of the right branch of your aortic arch. We're now going to look at the middle branch. What is the middle branch? The middle branch of the aortic arch becomes what artery? Yeah, it becomes a left common carotid artery. So you have to remember that your right common carotid and your left common carotid arteries are right next to each other. However, your right common carotid actually comes off of your brachiocephalic artery, and your left common carotid comes right off your aortic arch. So you want to keep that in mind. What's nice about your right and your left sides is they often mirror each other. So if you have a right common carotid artery that branches into an external and an internal common carotid, the left common carotid artery does as well. Okay, so the left common carotid is going to branch into an external and an internal common carotid. Now our left branch all the way to the left of our aortic arch is going to branch into what kind of artery here? Yep, that is our left subclavian, which again should sound familiar. We had a right subclavian, now we have a left subclavian. Your left subclavian runs on the left side of your body underneath the clavicle. So remember that your clavicle region is going to lead to your arm. So again, your left subclavian artery branches the same way that your right subclavian artery does. Remember, your right subclavian branched from an axillary to the brachial to your ulnar and radial. So your left subclavian artery will branch into the axillary, then to the brachial, and then to your radial and ulnar arteries. So back to our flow chart here, we are now going to be hanging out on the left side. So your aortic arch is going to become your left common carotid. Your left common carotid is going to split into the internal and external common carotids, just like we've talked about on the other side. Your aortic arch is going to then branch into our left subclavian. Your left subclavian leads to the axillary, which leads to your brachial, which leads to your ulnar and radial arteries. Next, we're going to be following the path of letter C here. So looking at letter C, what was the name of letter C? Yeah, that's going to be your descending aorta, right? A was the ascending aorta, B was the aortic arch, and C is our descending aorta. Now, if you look to the image to the left here that's labeled, what does our descending aorta connect to? Yeah, it connects to the abdominal aorta. The abdominal aorta, you can feel really well, actually. If you place your hands in like the region of your abdomen, like the middle region of your abdomen, you should be able to feel a pumping. That's your abdominal aorta. It's actually fairly easy to feel. What muscle is the abdominal aorta just inferior to? Yeah, that's the diaphragm. So if you look there, you can see that the diaphragm is just above where the abdominal aorta is. We are now taking a look at the celiac trunk and some of the parts that come off of your celiac trunk here. What artery does our celiac trunk come from? Well, we know that it's in the lower portion of the body. We know to get to the lower portion, we have to go through the descending aorta, and then we hit the abdominal aorta. So the artery that the celiac trunk comes from is the abdominal aorta. Looking at the arteries that come off of our celiac trunk here, there are 3 of them. So what are those arteries? And we have the left gastric artery, the splenic artery, and the common hepatic artery. So those are the three that we are talking about coming off the celiac trunk: the gastric, the hepatic, and the splenic arteries. Looking at the names of these things should help you see what they serve. So what organs get blood from these arteries? So what does the common hepatic artery serve? That's the liver. So what you want to think of with if you know that hepatic means liver, you're on the right track. But if you think of hepatitis affects the liver. So that's one way that you can kind of remember that. Okay, so hepatic means liver. How about the left gastric? And that's going to serve the stomach. So think of gastric acid, that's your stomach acid. And what about the splenic artery? Don't think too hard. Your splenic artery is going to serve the spleen. Okay, so those are what these arteries are giving blood to. So mesentery is a tissue that protects and holds your abdominal organs in place. It's an interesting tissue. When we dissect the cat, you're going to be able to see it really easily, and it's actually pretty interesting. What do the mesenteric arteries serve? This is an easy one, the mesentery, right? So it's going to serve the mesentery. Your digestive system and all that stuff needs a lot of blood to it so it can do its job correctly. So the mesentery is going to be served by those mesenteric arteries. Notice how you have a superior mesenteric and an inferior mesenteric artery. So you have one that's a little higher in the body and one that's a little lower in the body. We also have a gonadal artery. What are the gonadal arteries going to serve? Yeah, your gonads. Gonads are ovaries and testes. I have this little picture up of the ovary and the testes with little squares on them. I always think it's interesting with these pictures because both of the individuals in these pictures are looking down at each other's gonads. So that's appropriate, I think. So all of these are going to come off your abdominal aorta. So they come off the abdominal aorta, your superior mesenteric, your inferior mesenteric, and your gonadal arteries. Now we're getting to the pelvic and the leg region here. So what region of the body do we find our common iliac, our internal iliac, and our external iliac arteries? Yeah, this is in the general pelvic region. So that's what we're looking at with our common iliac, our internal iliac, and our external iliac. What's nice about this is if you know that part of your pelvic bones, one of them is called the ilium, right? So iliac should sound familiar, and it should make you think of the pelvic region. What artery does that common iliac artery come from? This is coming from the abdominal aorta. So your abdominal aorta is a huge, it's a huge blood vessel. A lot of things are coming off of that abdominal aorta. You can see that your common iliac artery is going to branch into both your internal iliac artery and the external iliac artery. Now, this comes in super handy if you've learned the regions of the body, if you've learned the bones of the body. These arteries should be like, yeah, this is pretty easy. All right, so when we look at these, where would we find our femoral artery? Yeah, in the femur area, right? Femoral, femur. Where would we find the popliteal artery? In the popliteal location, which is the back of the knee. Where would we find our anterior tibial artery? Yep, on the anterior tibia. Where would we find our posterior tibial artery? by the posterior tibia. All right, so if you know general regions, general locations, this should make sense. When you look at these arteries, you can see that your femoral artery is going to lead to the popliteal artery, which leads to both your anterior and your posterior tibia. So we have our flow chart started here. There's quite a few things that we've talked about so far. But your aortic arch, as it goes down, it's going to encounter the descending aorta. The descending aorta gives rise to our abdominal aorta. Now, our abdominal aorta gives rise to lots of stuff here. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk branches into 3 different parts. It's going to be the common hepatic, the left gastric, and the splenic arteries. Going back to your abdominal aorta, it's also going to serve those mesenteric arteries, so your superior and your inferior mesenteric. It also is going to serve our gonadal artery as well as our common iliac artery. Going from the common iliac artery, that branches into 2. So it branches into your internal and your external iliacs. Your external iliac goes down your leg. It's going to go to the femoral region, which then goes to the popliteal region, which then goes to our anterior and our posterior tibial regions. So we are all done with the arteries, and now we're going to switch over to veins. Since veins bring blood back to the heart, we're going to start at the appendages and we're going to go backwards. What's really nice about arteries and veins is they're named very similarly. So if you know where one is located, you know where the other is located because they are in the same general region. So the femoral vein would be in the same general region as what artery? Yep, the same general location as your femoral artery. How about the posterior tibial vein? Yep, same as your posterior tibial artery. How about the anterior tibial vein? Same as your anterior tibial artery and your popliteal vein. Same general region as your popliteal artery. So again, if you know one, you know the other. We also have another vein in our leg that stretches actually a very long way. It's called your great saphenous vein. Saphenous means easily visible or seen. If you've ever gone to the gym, this vein has probably popped up on you, or if you see people that are at the gym all the time, this vein is very easy to see on them. So next time you're at the gym and you're just like randomly looking at people's legs, you'll probably see the great saphenous vein. Not that you just look at people's legs, that'd be weird. But if you notice it, not a big deal. Looking at your great saphenous vein, what regions of the body contain that great saphenous vein? If you look over at the picture to the left, you see that it's in the femoral region, and it goes all the way through. It's going to go down into your, looks to be the tibial region of your body, all the way down to your ankle. So it stretches from the ankle to the knee to the femoral region. It's a very long vein. You can probably feel this vein on yourself. It's that vein that kind of pops up near your ankle, so right near the medial malleolus of your foot. You should be able to feel that great saphenous vein. So the great saphenous vein returns its blood to the femoral vein. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Just remember that it ends at the femoral region, so it's going to have to dump into the femoral vein. So as we follow blood back to the heart, we're going to go through the femoral vein to another vein here. So what veins are going to actually take in blood from the femoral vein? Yeah, it's going to be the external and internal iliac veins to the common iliac vein. So really your femoral vein is going to dump into your external iliac vein, which is going to lead to your common iliac. your internal iliac will also lead to that common iliac vein. Do these veins have corresponding arteries? Yes, right? We have the external and internal iliac arteries. We also have a common iliac artery, so they correspond. What region of the body are our common iliac, internal iliac, and external iliac veins bringing back blood from? Well, they are in the pelvic region, so it's going to bring back blood from that region. So starting with the appendages, we're going to go back into the heart. That's where we're going here. We're going to start near the bottom of our legs. We're going to start with our anterior and posterior tibial veins. Your anterior and posterior tibial veins lead to the popliteal vein. We also have our great saphenous vein that's running from our ankle all the way up to our femoral region where it ends. So both our popliteal and our great saphenous vein are going to dump their contents into the femoral vein. Your femoral vein dumps its contents into the external iliac. We also have an internal iliac vein. Both your external and your iliac veins are going to dump into the common iliac vein. Your common iliac vein will then dump into the inferior vena cava, which then dumps into the right atrium. So as we follow this through, hopefully those make sense. Now we're going to be hanging out in the midsection of the body here. So what region of the body does our hepatic vein get blood from? Yep, hepatic means liver, so we're going to be getting blood from the liver with a hepatic vein. What about the mesenteric veins? Are they going to get it? Where are they going to get their blood from? And they're going to get it from the mesentery. So see how we have superior mesenteric and an inferior mesenteric vein, very similar to the way that our arteries are set up. How about the gastric and splenic veins? Yep, our gastric vein is going to get it from the stomach, and our splenic veins are going to get it from the spleen. So these three that are circled are going to actually dump their blood into the hepatic vein. So your superior mesenteric, your inferior mesenteric, and your splenic vein are all going to dump in to the hepatic vein. The way that I remember this is you have a superior and inferior and a splenic vein. I say, like, if you sip a lot of alcohol, it'll go to your liver, and that's how I remember that. So superior S in the superior, I in the inferior, and the P in splenic. If you sip a lot of alcohol, it'll go to your liver. Which is true, actually. Otherwise, your hepatic and your gastric vein are going to go into your inferior vena cava. Just a side note, your inferior vena cava is going to take in a lot of the blood from these veins. Right, so we have an A and a B labeled here. I give you two choices to tell me what these are. So which one is A, the gonadal or the renal vein? Well, A is leading to the kidneys, and renal refers to the kidneys, so A is the renal vein. How about B then? Yeah, B is going to be the gonadal vein, okay, leading to the gonads. So what portion of the body does the gonadal vein return blood from? The gonads, right? The gonads are ovaries and testes. So that's where we are going to be returning blood from there. And what about our renal vein? It's going to be returning blood from the kidneys because that's what renal means. These both will dump their blood into one vena cava. Think about the location of where these things are. Which vena cava are we going to dump our blood into? Yeah, the inferior vena cava. We're lower in the body, so we're going to be dumping our blood into the inferior vena cava. Alrighty, so just a quick look back at the heart here. What do A and B represent? Yep, A is going to represent our superior vena cava, and B is our inferior vena cava. What do these veins dump their contents into? What portion of the heart? Yep, the right atrium of the heart. So these veins are going to dump their contents into the right atrium. Is the blood that runs through them oxygenated or deoxygenated? Well, they're colored in blue and they're veins, so they're going to be doing deoxygenated blood. Now we have to think about all of the veins that drain their contents into the inferior vena cava. There's quite a few of them, so I'm just kind of going to list them, some of them here. We have our gonadal, our hepatic, our renal, our gastric, and our common iliac. So we have quite a few that are going to drain their contents into your inferior vena cava. So we're gonna, again, go backwards when it comes to getting blood back to the heart. So we're gonna start where we were in the back. The first one we're gonna look at is our splenic, our superior, and our inferior mesenteric. So we know that those three are gonna be special. They're gonna go to the liver, right? And they're gonna go to the liver, which is that hepatic vein. Your hepatic, along with your renal, your gonadal, and your gastric veins are all going to dump into that inferior vena cava, which is going to go to the right atrium of your heart. So we're going to take a look here now at your arms, so your arm regions. We have these veins here. We have the axillary, the brachial, the median cubital, the radial, and the ulnar. Hopefully these terms make sense in terms of location. We also have the cephalic vein and the basilic vein as well. So what vein do you think A is? Yeah, A is going to be the axillary because it's in the axillary region. It's in the armpit region. What's B? Yep, that's the brachial region. It's the upper arm. What's C? Yep. C is the median cubital. Just think of that cuboidal, like that cubital fossa was right in the middle, right exactly where C is located on this slide. So median cubital is C. Radial would be D because it's on the side of the radius, and ulnar would be E because it's on the side of the ulna. Notice that we also have up in the brachial region, we have the cephalic and the basilic veins as well. So the cephalic is on the more lateral side and basilic is on the more medial side. I try to remember like the basilica. So the basilica at Notre Dame is the church. So the basilica, I often think of that there, so I can remember the church is close, right? Notre Dame is close. So that's how I remember that, at least in South Bend. Maybe not up in Dowagiac or not else. Anyways, that's how I remember it. So the cephalic, basilic, and median cubital veins all dump their contents into the brachial vein. So those three additional veins that don't correspond with arteries that we've talked about are going to dump into the brachial vein. We also have other veins that we're going to take a look at here. So the right subclavian, the brachiocephalic, your internal and your external jugular vein. When we look at your right subclavian vein, what veins are going to drain into the right subclavian vein? It's going to be the axillary vein, right? So the axillary vein was the most superior vein that your arms drain into. So your axillary vein is going to dump into the right subclavian vein. When we look at our external and internal jugular veins, what are they draining into? Yeah, they're draining into the brachiocephalic vein. Now, these should look familiar. The brachiocephalic should look familiar. Your internal and external jugular veins run very close to your internal and external common carotids. Okay, so that's kind of what they correspond with. What does the brachiocephalic vein drain into? It drains into the superior vena cava. So we have the right subclavian, we have the brachiocephalic, your external and internal jugular veins. When we look between your right and your left sides of the body, the only difference between the right and left sides of the body when it comes to veins is the fact that instead of it being called the right subclavian, it's called the left subclavian vein. Otherwise, it's mirror image of each other. All right, so one more look at the flow chart here. We're going to start at the bottom here with your median cubital, your cephalic, and your basilic veins. They're going to dump into the same vein as your radial and ulnar vein, which is going to be the brachial vein. The brachial vein dumps into the axillary, which then goes into the subclavians, right or left, depending on what side of the body you are on, which then goes to the brachiocephalic, which then goes to the superior vena cava, which then goes to the right atrium. So just making sure you know, like the median cubital, the cephalic, and the basilic are not below. They're not inferior to the radial and ulnar veins. I just couldn't make the slide how I wanted to. So when you look at the flow chart on the actual piece of paper, it's a little bit more clear. All right, we made it through this lecture, so don't forget you have the Unit 5 homework assignment, Module 16. This is the last homework assignment for this unit. There are those flow charts, so please use those to kind of help you understand how the veins are placed and how the arteries are placed throughout our body. And then the Unit 5 Quiz 3 is due. Remember, your exam is coming up for this unit shortly, so make sure that you are studying for that.